We are moderating ourselves today, so we will each introduce ourselves. My name is Becky Williams. I am the Senior Director for Sexual Ethics and Advocacy at the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women. And I am pleased to be here today in this particular workshop. This is a workshop I am very passionate about, and I believe it is at the root of the reason we are having this conference and continue to have this issue that we're having to look in the eye. It isn't a slip up. It isn't a poor decision. We all do those regularly. It is misuse of power, and we cannot forget that. So I could stay here the rest of the day and evening and talk to you about this, but I welcome your questions. We want your questions. We want to continue this conversation. So you have paper and pen. Feel free to write those down. If we run out of time, hand those to us, and we will definitely get a response to you. So thank you for being here. Simple reminder, the evaluations will be sent out to you tomorrow via email. The minute the conference is over with, you will get that evaluation form.
Thank you, Becky. My name is Neal Christie, and I'm Assistant General Secretary with the General Board of Church and Society. My office is in Washington, D.C., and my ministry is throughout the Connection. I'm responsible for an area called Education and Leadership Formation, and one of the priorities for us at GBCS is teaching the social principles, working with our colleagues in local churches, conferences, both in jurisdictions and in central conferences, in the application of the social principles. For the purposes today, I'm very grateful to Becky for the invitation to co-facilitate this workshop. I'm feeling slightly overwhelmed by the amount of material that's been shared in the past 2 days. Day and a half. It's a lot. The workshops, I've been in listening mode. I'm clergy. I'm a member of the Greater New Jersey Conference. I've served churches. I was a hospital chaplain prior to coming to GBCS. But in the capacity that I have as an educator and as an advocate, some public policy on Capitol Hill at the local level, but majority working with leadership to get them to a place where they can do advocacy, whether it's through organizing or whether it's through a deeper understanding of particular issues, in some cases legislative, in some cases purely public policy. This material for me is incredibly new, and I've been serving the church since 1990. And so I am impressed by my colleagues who have a particular avocation as well as vocation to this kind of ministry in the local church, the district, and at the annual conference level. So I am eager to hear from you how our social principles, the teaching of the church, which is what my responsibility for this workshop is, how that is a tool for you in, number one, understanding the role of power and privilege in the church and in society, as it revolves around sexual ethics and the abuse of women. This is the first piece. The second piece is what you're doing. What are you already engaged in terms of prevention and intervention that where the social principles are assist you in that kind of ministry. And thirdly, what is the kind of a witness we can have as Christians to the ecumenical and interfaith community around sexual ethics, and how the social principles might be an additional tool for you in your public witness outside the church. And so I'm eager to hear from you, and I'm grateful for your participation in this workshop. We're going to begin with, everyone has a copy of the social principles, right? You don't? Okay, thank you. We're going to be referring to the social principles. I'm going to be referring to the social principles for the next hour, back and forth. And I'm going to invite you to do some reflection on specific social principles. But let me give you a reminder. Please forgive me if this is something you know and it's old hat to you, but So we're on a common footing here. We remember that the social principles we have one set of social principles in the United Methodist Church. We can debate outside the United States, as I do with our colleagues there, whether you can add to them or take out pieces that are less attractive, that seem to conflict with pieces of culture. But the reality is the social principles are the social principles of the United Methodist Church. They're the principles for the whole global church or the worldwide church. We have 44,000 churches in 53 countries. How we understand then sexual ethics as embedded within the social teaching of our church and the social principles is a challenge. I think that the blessing is that we have a common vocabulary. We have a common vocabulary around positions, interests, values, and needs. What do I mean by that? The social principles include, there are 71 social principles. There are 8 that have to do with sexual ethics, explicitly 8 that have to do with sexual ethics. I would argue that there are additional ones in the economic section, in the world community section, that have to do with sexual ethics as well, but that are quite explicit. There are 8, and 7 of them have to do really with women and violence against women, sexual violence and other forms of violence against women. So we've got the positions of the church. We've got about 7 or 8 social principles that have to do with the material we're dealing with this week. The second thing I'd comment on is this. Every social principle reflects a set of interests, and we're going to go through each one that has to do with sexual ethics today. There are particular interests represented. There are some interests that may not be represented, and there's a rationale for that. Now, the challenge for you as advocates is to be able to articulate why those interests are present and which interests may be absent, at least for the time being, for the next until 2016, if it's changed. Take a look at, and here, let me give you an example. In the social principles, do we have a social principle on pornography? Do we have does anyone know? No, we do not. Do we have
introducing a petition in 2016.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. That's correct. Yes. And there are people, and it's this is almost mind-boggling, isn't it? That we don't have a social principle on porn. We don't have a social principle on human trafficking either. And so again, we have a very strong one on gambling, one on death penalty. We have one on sexual harassment. We have one on sexual abuse, but we do not have one on pornography. So each social principle reflects a position, a legislative position of the church. It's a product of the parliamentary procedure of our church. It represents interests, interest groups, the opportunity to represent underrepresented or marginalized groups. Every social principle embedded within each social principle is a third level. The third level are sets of values. What are the values that we affirm as a United Methodist Church in this decade for this time? What are the biblical, the theological, the ethical values that are cross-cultural, that are generic, that are part of the narrative that we want to support? And so we want to take a look this afternoon at what specific values that are present in the current social principles having to do with sexual ethics. So we've got the interests. Underneath we've got the values. Underneath each value, however, are needs. What are the basic human needs that, if not met, will perpetuate violence or an imbalance of power or an imbalance around privilege or access to privilege or access to power? The social principles reflect an attempt on the part of the church to address and advocate for particular human needs. What are basic needs? Well, we know there are basic needs that we all share: food, water, sense of safety, belonging, air. Now, when we get more specific in terms of our gender and vulnerability, then we have other particular needs, and those needs are named in each of the social principles that we'll look at. So for me, this is a helpful paradigm, and deconstructing the social principles. We go a little further, a little deeper than the position, or taking one position. I'm going to share one social principle with you. I'm going to invite you to reflect on it on your own, and then I'm going to invite you to turn to a partner, and then to share your first thoughts on it. And I'm going to, if you would like to follow with me in the booklet, you're welcome to do it. Otherwise, just listen. Listen to it carefully, and I'll repeat it twice. It says in the preamble, which is found on page 18, that we are to honor the sacred worth of all people. We heard that the first day, didn't we, of the conference? We heard the language of sacred worth, and we hear it embedded in throughout the conversation, I'd like to think throughout all the workshops, but certainly throughout the plenaries, it's present. I would argue we cannot even begin to talk about power if we don't affirm the value of sacred worth. But listen to this. It says, from the sacred worth of all people. It says, language of a derogatory nature, found on page 22, with regard to race, nationality, ethnic background, gender, sexuality, physical difference, does not reflect value for one another and contradicts the gospel of Jesus Christ. Notice that within the social principles, gender is not segregated out. Is one example where abuse of power occurs. Gender is included alongside other forms of other either interest groups or other realities where we see the abuse of power. I think that's a healthy way to understand sexual ethics, because when I look at the social principles, as an advocate, I cannot segregate out sexual ethics from someone's class, ethnicity, geographical location. It's much more difficult for me to do the work I do if I don't take into consideration the fullness of someone's context. In the social principles on page 22 in nurturing community that I just read to you, it says that these contradict the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are a few places in our social principles where we say some action contradicts the gospel of Jesus Christ. They all have to do with violence, with the exception of one. Okay? The exception of one, which has to do with intimate relationships. War, draft, slavery, torture, gambling, media violence, sexual harassment, exploitative sexual behavior, the practice of homosexuality, that's the only one, does not have to do with violence in the language of the social principles. My point here is this. We're very clear in our social principles about what we mean. We don't really describe what we mean by contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ, but we're very clear to name or to invoke that something does not align itself with what we understand to be the gospel, isn't it? They most all have to do with some form of violence. If you look again, the majority have some bearing on sexual ethics, because we cannot look at war without understanding sexual ethics. My sisters and brothers who are coming from the Central Conferences understand this, because of the effect of war on women, and violence against women is a weapon of war. This is a reality that our church is dealing with. We cannot deal with one issue in isolation. I'm going to ask you to listen to this social principle and now turn to your neighbor. It says that we reject norms that assume different standards for women than men in marriage. It says we affirm the scripture, the common humanity of male and female, both having equal worth in the eyes of God. We reject the erroneous notion that one gender is superior to another, that one gender must strive against another, that members of one gender may receive love, power, and esteem only at the expense of another. When you hear that statement, I want you to turn to your neighbor. How does that social principle affect you? And I'll read it to you again. It says, we affirm with Scripture the common humanity of male and female having both equal worth in the eyes of God. We reject the erroneous notion that one gender is superior to another, that one gender must strive against another, that members of one gender may receive love, power, and esteem only at the expense of another. How does that social principle affect you? What's one way that it affects you? Just take 2 minutes with your partner. I'm going to give you one more and then turn it back over to Becky. The social principles say this, and this is found on page 22 as well. But listen for this, and this is a different question I'm going to ask you. I'd like you to talk about the values that you hear. What are the values that are affirmed in the social principle? Whose need does it seek to meet? What values are affirmed and whose need does it seek to meet? And this is the statement. It says, we especially reject the idea that God made individuals as incomplete fragments, made whole only in union with one another. We call upon women and men alike to share power and control, to learn to give freely and to receive freely, to be complete and to respect the wholeness of others. We seek for every individual opportunities and freedom to love and to be loved, to seek and to receive justice, and to practice ethical self-determination. What are the values affirmed? Whose needs does it seek to meet? With your partner, 1 minute each. Thank you.
This obviously is energizing for this group. It's as Neal was reading it out, I was thinking, oh my gosh, just bite my tongue. I could just talk forever on what those social principles meant for me in my life. So what a wonderful way to give us a foundation to build this work upon, and know that Neal and I are going to tag team on this today, and so I hope that won't be too confusing for you as I say something that triggers something for him that he needs to say. We just want to make sure we can give you as much information as we can possibly give you in this time. Do you have a question?
One comment.
Sure.
I do think, because I do human sexuality seminars for junior and senior high youth, and
Yes.
I use the paragraph F of human sexuality where it says, we deplore all forms of commercialization, abuse, exploitation of sex. I've used that for my pornography piece.
Right,
I say that we should
right.
not do that.
Absolutely.
Even though it doesn't come out and say it that way, that's my
Right,
interpretation.
right.
So I do think it's here.
Right, and a little bit of that language is in the legislation that is being introduced at General Conference around pornography, the exact stuff. So yes, you're right. Thank you for bringing our awareness to that. Absolutely. So, in addition to our social principles, this subject of power and vulnerability has some rich theological grounding, doesn't it? And you can probably think of some stories in the Bible right off. You flip your computer on in the morning, or if you still get the paper, open the paper, or listen to public radio, or whatever your means is to connect with the world. And it's not unusual for us to hear reports of where people in positions of power have used it well and have then turned right around and used it very poorly to the point of doing harm for people, so or with people. So I just want to run through this very familiar person in the Bible for us real quickly to add to our foundation. We're introduced to him as a young boy, David, who is able to do an amazing thing in confronting Goliath. We're introduced to him again as a young shepherd who goes across the countryside making beautiful music and sharing story through beautiful words of poetry. We know him again as a most devoted friend to Jonathan. So David has been very victorious in military battles. His reign is pretty secure, and he is extremely popular with his people. We know this person, don't we? We know this person. He's very established. He's settled in luxury and plenitude in the palace. And in general, things are pretty sweet for David at this point in his life. So again, we know this person. We know this person. It's important for us to understand who this is. And then what happens to David? His gaze falls upon Bathsheba. And we know the rest of that story, don't we? It becomes very destructive and traumatic event. He's a man of passion. He has deeply felt emotions. He represents the best and the worst of us. Let me say that again. He represents the best and the worst of us. It's a great example of how power can be used in those ways that can turn the best of us into people capable of doing very unhealthy and hurtful things. So I ask you this question as we begin this, for you to ponder. How do you humble yourself? How do you humble yourself? I'm not a minister. My career is 30 plus years in the mental health field, about 27 of those years in private practice as a therapist. When I left that position, I had a very large percentage of my clientele were clergy and or clergy family members. This was an issue that was wrestled with whether they were brand new, coming straight out of seminary and into their first appointment, or they were in their 30th year of ministry. The power that was given to them, or is given to them as clergy, that is inherent in the position of ministry, and add to that the story of David, where things get sweet, where people find themselves in a position where they are on a pedestal, where they are called into the most intimate times of a person's life, and they have the ability to offer words and comfort and compassion that is transformative for people's lives. It's very easy to let that begin to rule who you think you are. And so that power can become extremely unhealthy and extremely dangerous. So here are the facts. See how these sit with you. Every clergy or minister is a symbol of religious authority. The minister interprets religious truth. Listen to this. Interprets religious truth, the meaning of life, the way of faith, and even the reality of God for so many people. Again, you're invited into those most intimate moments in a person's life. When we misunderstand and when we ignore this power, we create the opportunity for misuse and abuse. When we misunderstand and we ignore this power, we create the opportunity for misuse and abuse. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, that question you first asked, I almost answered out loud. I know it was before.
Okay, well, go for it. How do you humble yourself?
Just as a minister, when I first transitioned into being a minister, this is my second profession life, the thing that was evident to me was to remember always I was a servant. And I would tell my members that I and even now as a district superintendent. That's the thing that keeps me humble. Remember, I'm a servant. The word is not mine. The gifts are not mine, and I'm not mine. So everything I do is in service to the Lord, and it's, I have my, I'm a human, of course, but when I get in those tight spots of catching myself about to cross over a line that I shouldn't, to like push authority or something, I remember that all that I am and all that I have is not mine anyway, that I'm a servant. And that servant mode is a humbling thing to me, especially since I'm sort of strong-willed and assertive and aggressive. That's the thing that calms me down, is to be humbled as a servant, which is sort of hard. It's a discipline.
Thank you for that honesty. And if we're all honest, we would probably share in that as well. Yes.
I don't think I can drag this all the way. I don't think all of us operate, first of all, in these assumptions.
Okay.
And I don't think we're always, pardon me?
If you can speak up a little louder, I need to be able to hear it to translate for our folks.
I don't think we're all seeing the same way. When I served in a cross-racial appointment, it was very clear to me I was not the power person.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything I said and did was questioned. So I wasn't the one with power. They presumed they were the ones with power, and that we had to negotiate that power. And even as a superintendent, I've been told by folks I was asking to enter into a covenant relationship with me because something needed to be done in their church or whatever. They said, well, we'll do it because you're our boss. And that is not the dynamic I wanted to portray, or did even portray, I don't believe. But that was their understanding of the position and not me as a person.
Right. And so let me just respond to that. They do, in terms of being in relationship with them, you are in a position of power. Absolutely. Yeah, I know you. I mean, yeah.
But I'm saying even those of us who are African American, Hispanic, Asian women in those positions do not have the same positional power that white males have. And we should not even begin to think that way.
I want to piggyback what she just said, because there will be instances where people will say things that are derogatory racially in order to minimize who you are.
Absolutely.
I agree with that. I think I'm the deep South person. I'm Mississippi. And so I'm very well aware. I'm, matter of fact, first black, first female in the 104 churches I serve. But I guess also you need to have a point, regardless of what others perceive of you. You need to know who you are. And then you need to have a grounding piece to keep yourself in check. Because if you're a very assertive, aggressive person like I am, you'll get yourself in trouble. When you overstretch yourself.
That piece is also very important, because at some point in time, you've got to sit down with yourself and recognize, when you talk about how you stay humble, who brought you to that place, who will keep you and help you to navigate through. I think I know your bishop.
Yeah.
But what keeps our colleagues humble? In our relationship with us, what is it that keeps our colleagues humble?
Right.
Because some of them are perpetrators.
Absolutely. We get calls too often on those situations. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So maybe in a teaching piece or something, there would be the opportunity to offer that question in a covenant group, to plant that seed anytime you can among your colleagues, be that in laity or ordained. How are we keeping ourselves humble in this work? Because yes, absolutely, please hear me say, not only just because of who I am, but certainly in my position with COSRO, yes. It's harassment, and it's that because of the nature of gender, because of the nature of race, because of the nature of socioeconomic status. Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Yes?
I know we talked about this a little bit in the response teams.
Yes.
That even when we don't have leadership power in the congregation, even when we're being undermined kind of left and right, we still have that kind of the religious power, that second point that we interpret religious truth and the meaning of life. Oftentimes, we don't even realize we're doing it, and we're embodying God to people, and that is an incredible power.
Yes. Incredible power, yeah. And I would also say that I can't help but just wonder, out of curiosity, that some of the questioning and some of the belittling and demeaning and degrading comments that are made may be made as a result of that first piece. Because in your position says you are a religious authority. And there are people who don't want you to be their religious authority because you're a woman or because of your skin color or whatever. Yeah. So yes, and thank you for reminding me of that. Any other comments on that? And I present this to you simply to say, when there is misuse and abuse of power, it is in relationship with vulnerability. Okay, it takes those two ingredients to make it happen. And so when we're talking about power in relation to, that's where power has its potency, is in relation to someone or something. Okay? Okay. You had a question?
Just going to dovetail the comment here, that sometimes the power or the influence that we exert may not be in the relationship with the person who is challenging our authority or who is trying to take it from us. It may be the silent one who is witnessing with that. And in that regard, even though somebody chooses to deny who we are or wants to reject that, we still hold that witness and that representation to the silent voice that is witnessing this.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions before we move on? So again, just reiterating, I share this from this perspective because this is when we have problems, is when power is misused in relationship to people in vulnerable positions. And when people call you, they tell you things they're not going to tell anyone else. I mean, they do. They do. I have, yeah. People will, as a therapist, certainly people have told me many things. And I also know people will go to a minister and share what feels like information that would be very unsafe to share with someone else. That's very much a position of vulnerability and in relation to the power that comes with the minister's position. So another self-inventory. And I offer this to you genuinely hoping, it's the whole theme of this conference, is that you will leave here, you will take this information, and you will use it in a way that can be helpful in making the road to Jericho a little safer. for those that we are in ministry to. And so I offer this to you, saying, take this, use this in your covenant groups, in any type of meetings with lay leadership, with staff, with female clergy that you're in covenant with male clergy that you're in covenant with, wherever it could be helpful for you. So where is your power rooted? We all have it. We have it. Where is it rooted? Is it about money? Is it about money being the bottom line? Or just the bottom line? Having the final say-so? Rules? Control? Competition? Manipulation? Again, I think probably most of us, we can either relate to some of that personally, or we can recall people that we have been in relationship with where power came from these sources. I see money, and I don't know why I do this, probably some of my earliest work back in the early 80s, but the relationship between landlords and tenants, and especially tenants in low-income housing, and oftentimes substandard housing. And those landlords were often people that had a lot of money and had a lot of power and had a lot of control over legislation when advocates would go forward wanting to get something done about that, and all of a sudden how would you argue with what was being shown that people were living in? And all of a sudden it wouldn't be passed, and you would know why it wasn't passed. And it had to do with the control and the money and the power and the vote that one might lose. Or is your power rooted in truth and mercy, in grace and dignity, in regard and respect? So when it's there, it's not about you one-upping anyone. It's not about you using anyone. It's about you meeting people where they are. It's about you being in relationship with rather than relationship over. That's a very healthy place to be in ministry, again, whether we're talking about clergy or we're talking about laity. A very healthy place. Some of you saw this yesterday in the response team. It's just a quick little graph. When we talk about power, we're talking about having greater resources. And when we have greater resources, we have the potential for helping or the potential for hurting. When we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about having fewer resources. And we're talking about the potential for being helped or the potential for being hurt. And within the context of the church, and again, whether we're talking about campus ministry, camping ministry, local pastor, local churches and pastors in those churches, wherever the setting is, the person in the position of power can go quickly from the caregiver to the oppressor. And it's what we see in David, how quickly the person can go from being admired, being respected, to that shift happening and losing that. I used yesterday the example of fire. Fire in and of itself is not bad, in and of itself is not good. But we know it can cook a good meal, and we know it can destroy property rapidly. It's how it's used. It's how it's used. So who then is responsible? share with me some of your thoughts, and Neal, I welcome your input on this. Share with me some of your thoughts. How do we hold a person in a power position accountable? Okay.
I want to quote the social
Well,
principles.
sometimes, well, you can, absolutely.
But actually, if I could, I'll read to you what the social principles say.
Yes, please do.
But the first word that comes to mind is infrastructure, right? We have accountabilities, but the social principles say, and then let's relate it back to your question. The social principles say on page 24 under Nurturing Community, it says, we deplore all forms of the commercialization, abuse, and exploitation of sex. All right, if that's the case, we deplore all forms of the commercialization, abuse, and exploitation of sex, then we need to answer your question, first we need to, and I'm not sure if I'm getting at the answer that you'd want, but we need to make sure that we have in place a financial system and economic systems at the local level and the macro level that do not perpetuate the degradation, the sale of women's bodies, number one. That's the first thing I would say, and that's based on the social principles. So it has to do with economics, and it goes back to the landlord-tenant case study that you raised. The second is exploitation of sex. So then the further conversation around what does it mean to have non-exploitative intimate relationships, and to have that kind of a conversation. I think the social principles put this in the negative in terms of exploitation as a verb, right? But what would be the positive? What would be the opposite of exploitation? What's an alternative to exploitation? What comes to mind? Honor, value, dignity, mutuality, transparency, trust, right? So I would even challenge you to take a look at these social principles and put them in the positive. So you see the negative and then you see the positive. So what does it mean in terms of vulnerability, the unhealthy sense of vulnerability that you're describing here, where people have access to fewer resources, which leads to the potential to being put in a place of harm, right? The social principles on sexual ethics tend to be put in the negative, several of them, in terms of commercialization of sex, in terms of abuse, exploitation. What would you put in terms of the positive? What would you say we affirm? So that's the first way I'd get to answer your question. The second would be this. It says that we recognize that family violence and abuse in all its forms, verbal, psychological, physical, sexual, is detrimental to the covenant of the human community. That's found on page 24. I'll read it again. It says, we recognize the family violence is abuse. And abuse, so it's not just talking about family violence, it's talking about abuse in all its forms. Verbal, psychological, physical, sexual is detrimental to the covenant of human community. So if that's the case, then according to the social principles, I need to look at what will bring healthy psychological relationships, mutual relationships. I need to look at physical. It says physical, so what are the boundaries? What are the physical boundaries we're dealing with? Recognizing that sexual ethics is it's not about personal ethics solely. It's about community ethics. And I think for me, that's a healthy way to understand sexual ethics, is not in isolation, but it has to do with the health of a community. And what will make a community healthy such that we support a healthy understanding of sexual ethics and a healthy understanding of empowerment? It's one way to get it.
And I scrolled back and put that slide back up as you were talking, because it was almost like what I was hearing you describe, Neal, when you were talking about it being placed in the negative, and then what is the opposite of exploitation, is it has to do with some of this. Where is the power rooted? And when we think about exploitation, we may think of that top part. money, the bottom line, rules, control, competition, manipulation. It's just and then when you think about value, the opposite of exploitation, it tends to be the other piece of where power may be rooted. Yes?
How come justice is not listed in its section?
Because I didn't have you to tell me to put it up there, honestly, probably. And I will make myself a note, because that would, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Regard and respect, to me, if we're going to do justice, I think regard and respect, truth and mercy are huge components of that. But absolutely, I think it would fit up there beautifully.
Justice, Peace, Truth, and Mercy ministries, there's a tremendous difference on how we approach that. And we get wrapped up in doing more mercy ministries than we do justice ministries.
I agree. And it's interesting, the social principles when it comes to sexual ethics doesn't appeal to justice language. It's very interesting you raise this, but when you take a look at it, those 7 or 8 places where we're talking about sexual ethics, it doesn't begin from a place of justice, right, or equity. It ends up there, but it begins from a place of sacred worth. It begins from the language I began with. It begins with a larger sense of community. Then it gets more specific, but even there, it's not saying justice explicitly. It says, I'll give you another social principle. It says, sexual harassment must be understood as an exploitation of power. Did I read this one already? No. Power, relationships, rather than an exclusively sexual issue. Sexual harassment includes, but is not limited to, the creation of a hostile or abusive working environment resulting from discrimination on the basis of gender. So are we talking about justice? Absolutely, we're talking about justice. But the social principles become much more specific. They're looking at the causes, they're looking at the effect, and they're naming the specific behavior. But it is interesting that the language of justice isn't where it begins. Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
How do I feel at church and society? I think, honestly, rhetorically, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it because the social principles affirm sacred worth, belonging, dignity, and it begins from a place of, it begins from a theological place of how God has identified us in relationship to God and how God has created us in relationship to community. That's the starting place. And I think that for me, that opens the door for, it allows more room. I think that justice language, while absolutely necessary, and in the social principles, when we talk about the economic community, when we talk about political community, when we talk about human rights issues, absolutely we're talking about human rights in women, in relation to women. But it's not as explicit. It's not as explicit as these other sections. Now, am I okay? I'm okay with it. I think that these issues absolutely include justice, but they begin from a different starting place. And I think that for some people, it's more approachable this way. I think if we begin with language of justice, it introduces language of retributive justice versus restorative justice. Punitive relationship, punitive. So it's a different place. It's a different beginning place.
Thank you for. We always walk away learning more when we engage ourselves and are open to these conversations. So I do not have a watch on. Does someone have the time?
4.
5 after 4. Okay. So the first question is, how do we hold a person in power accountable? And then what are our ordination vows, including loyalty to the United Methodist Church, accountability to the bishop and annual conference, charged with authority of leadership? I shared with the group in the second response team's training yesterday that I came across a piece the other day, and I really want to do something with it. And I share it with you. I'm open to any feedback if you want to talk to me afterwards or whatever. But it was a specific covenant that people in ministerial leadership, and in the plenary with Bill a few minutes ago, the question was raised from Lydia in Mozambique that regarding when it's laity that's involved in some of this misuse of power and sexual misconduct that happens. So the covenant was about literally a writing, if you will, that said, basically, this is very paraphrased, in my position of ministerial leadership, I enter into a covenant acknowledging my power and how I will use it. And it went on to describe specific, the ways in which you will use it in leadership, the ways in which you will use it in teaching and preaching and whatever. And I just thought, I don't know if you feel like there's already adequate accountability that you literally, figuratively, and again, it may not solve a lot of problems, but it also, it's sort of like when my child became a teenager and we began talking about drinking and driving. Well, we can talk about it all day long and she understands what the consequences are or whatever, but when I asked her to sign a sheet of paper between me and her that said, I will not drive if I have been drinking, I felt like there was the potential for a little more accountability from her in that. It may not have always worked. I don't know. I didn't find out if it didn't. But sometimes just going through the process of we acknowledge that we have been charged with quite an authority of leadership. And how will we use that? Who is the Nathan among us? So Nathan was the person, the prophet, who had the courage to stand up to David. Had the courage to say, what's happening here is not okay. About 2 weeks ago, I was invited to speak to a lawyers' conference, and we were talking about sexual harassment. And there was a woman there, an attorney, and she was in the very back of the room, and she raised her hand, and she said, 30 years ago, I was in a situation where a woman next to me was spoken down to. She was demeaned, she was degraded, she was belittled. And I said nothing. And it's 30 years later, and I'm sitting in this workshop as a credentialed attorney of many, many years, and this still haunts me. And so I just simply said, so out of curiosity, what would you have liked to have said? And she said simply that I would have looked that person in the eye and said, that is not okay. What you have just said and done in relationship to this other human is not okay. And so who are the Nathans among us? Are you willing to speak up? It's not unusual for us to be contacted when a victim has disclosed what has happened to them to a minister. And the minister is not willing to account for that when the complaint is made, because it means their colleague, their friend, that is being identified as the perpetrator, and that's a very yucky place to be. And I don't doubt that it is a yucky place to be, and yet at the same time, we're called to do this work. So who are the Nathans among you? How can this information, I'm just brainstorming here, how can this information be used with laity in your ministry? How can the story of David be offered in a small group setting where the opportunity? How can the social principles be read and then you turn to someone in your small group? What can be said from the pulpit that speaks to these issues? This is the work that I think we have to go out and do. 'Cause I said I wasn't a preacher, but I feel like right now I'm preaching. And I'm not preaching to the choir. I mean, I know I am preaching to the choir. I know I am. So what can you do? Where can you take this information?
I think what you're saying needs to be done, all of us to be proactive instead of reactive.
So what was said is that this sounds like an invitation to be proactive rather than reactive. Yeah.
And we have to do it. Sometimes we're called to be the Nathans.
Absolutely you are. Thank you
It's
for
not
affirming
an easy
that.
spot to be in, but we're called to do it. And we come to get trained here. Hopefully, we're going to take this information back to our annual conferences to be able to share this with others
Right.
and make a difference.
Right.
One thing is asking, and this is maybe a little less intimidating for people, is to reflect on who has been the Nathan for you. In other words, who has been the advocate for you, and to open a conversation that way. And I think that once people start to name those resources, those persons who have been resources, grounding resources for them, it opens the opportunity for us to name, for others to be able to name it as well. The second piece to this, I'm going back to social principles here, is the social principle on sexual assault, because I know we're moving quickly through time here. It says, sexual assault is wrong. We affirm the right of all people to live free from assault. We encourage efforts of law enforcement to prosecute such crimes and condemn rape in all forms. It does not matter what they are wearing, what the person is wearing, whether or not he or she is intoxicated, if he or she is flirtatious, what the victim's gender or any other circumstance. It's found on page 28. It was a new social principle added in 2012. I would, if I were to read that social principle, right, which seems so apparent, so obvious to us, I think, I'd like to think, yet when I work with college students and work with high school students, it absolutely is not clear. They disagree on it. And I'll have half the women agreeing with it and half the women disagreeing with it, as well as the young men, when they're honest. When I have 25 interns I supervise who are college age every year, and I have about 7 seminary students. The seminary students get it. The college students are not in the same place. My challenge, one way that I get at this kind of an issue with them in terms of responsibility for power is, again, in the context of sexual assault, do a power analysis, basic power analysis. Who in a story, just like the David story, who in your life have you seen? When have you seen a time when a woman in this case, a woman or a girl, has been assaulted. And every person I talk to has put their hand up. It's very rare for me to talk to a young person who does not have an example. Just like it's very rare for me to talk to a young person who doesn't know someone who's tried to commit suicide. I've talked to fourth graders who tell me about suicides that people have tried to commit. And their people are coming from Mississippi to Washington, D.C. I'm not talking about kids that are living in D.C. I'm talking about kids that are coming from around the country. So so that's the power, I was going to say scripture, but that's the social principle that I appeal to. But the final social principle I go back to is in a positive light. It says, we affirm women and men to be equal in every aspect of their common life. We therefore urge every effort to be made to eliminate sex role stereotypes. Okay, we're getting at solutions here. Sex role stereotypes. Nope, but we can unpack what a stereotype is. But it says we affirm it. In activities and portrayal of family life, aspects of voluntary and compensatory participation in church and society, we affirm the right of women to equal treatment in employment, responsibility, promotion, compensation. We affirm the importance of women in decision-making positions at all levels of church and society. We urge such bodies to guarantee their presence through policies of employment and recruitment. We support affirmative action as one method of addressing the inequalities and discriminatory practices within church and society. And we affirm the right of women to live free from violence and abuse and urge governments to enact policies that protect women against all forms of violence and discrimination in any sector of society. So what are the practical applications? And as someone who works in Washington, D.C., this is a reality. I can only do so much in terms of the life of a congregation. I can make a difference with those who are living in a place of power, a position of power, as David. I mean, what's so intriguing about this story, this parable, is that David is a perpetrator, but he's an elected official, right? He's got the power to change the policy, doesn't he? And we've got a role in terms of advocating to those Davids and holding them accountable. Nathan held him accountable to his interpersonal breach of boundaries, didn't he? But Nathan, as a prophet, is also holding him accountable for the role he has as a policymaker. And so I would challenge us, all those who are part of this conference, to consider themselves as advocates at that level as well. What is our role in affecting policies both in church and in society that continue to legitimate the violence against women?
Amen.
I've worked in the church for about 34 years, and I believe that we have the best stuff on paper that exists.
Absolutely.
But I have lived a very different reality. And in even circles that I've been close to folks, and the best thing I can do is give you an example. We wanted to have an inclusive slate at one point for general conference. And as long as it was 2 white men at the beginning of the delegation, it was okay. When 2 black women got at the beginning, then we had a problem. We started looking for folks in other circles to talk about being inclusive. And I asked the question of my colleagues. I said, well, why was it inclusive when 2 males got elected at the top of the slate, and all of a sudden we're not being inclusive when 2 black women are at the top of the slate? And there was complete silence. Silence. I never got an answer. So I'm saying, I believe in what we're saying, but I want to, like I said, I've been working since 1979. And I was 62 about 3 weeks ago. I got 30 years in, and I keep reminding the bishop.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I want to see a time when we don't continue to perpetuate a power dynamic that's the antithesis of what we say we believe.
Right.
But then when we get in these groups, we act in the very same ways that we have always acted. I
had a man come into my office for his one-on-one. He's 82 years old, and here's what he said to me. He said, you know, in 1964, I had to get out of the way for the EUB. In 1968, I had to get out of the way for black people. In 1970s, I had to get out of the way for women. So now I think I'm the minority. And this is a white man, and I reminded him, y'all had all the seats at the table. Now who got out of whose way? So I'm just saying, we still keep saying the same old things and acting the same old ways. When is the church really going to take some of this stuff seriously? I hope I live long enough to see it in a variety of places, because I don't really get to experience it.
Well, thank you so much for that, and I'll tell you, I am humbled to get to know you at this level, that you've been at it that long and you still come to something like this. I mean, I mean that, but you know, what my response to that is that our position at COSRO is we say to the world, hold us accountable to do what we said we would do, or that we say we will do as a church. And it's what I've said to Neal and to others at Church and Society. Why are these social principles not being put in the face of everyone all the time? Because it says some good stuff. And yeah. That's right. But do you know how many people think we don't need a commission on women because or that we don't need social principles?
That's my whole point.
Okay. I think Lydia in Mozambique has a question, and then we'll wrap up. I think we're about out of time.
Sim, muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Eu queria falar da experiência que eu tenho.
I wanted to share the experience that I've been having.
Embora vocês podem entender, é muito diferente do que está-se a falar em relação aos direitos da mulher em Moçambique.
It may be very different than what we're talking about, but it's in relation to the rights
Na
of women
página
in Mozambique.
23, deste livro, fala de igualdade da mulher e do homem perante os olhos de Deus.
On page 23, you're talking about the equality of men and women in the eyes of God.
É realmente nos olhos de Deus que estas pessoas são iguais, mas não são muito iguais.
And it's really in the eyes of God that we're equal, because oftentimes we're not as equal.
E nos princípios sociais,
In these social principles,
religiosos
religious
e jurídicos,
and legal,
a mulher sempre está em desvantagem.
women are always at the disadvantage.
Em todos os mundos, nós aqui estamos a aprender para ver se minimizamos.
And it's true in all these worlds, and we're here learning on how to minimize that difference.
As diferenças existem, vou contar uma história que acontece em Moçambique.
These differences exist, and I'll share a story of what happens in Mozambique.
Esta história me obrigou a fazer uma palestra que estou a dar nas igrejas.
And that situation led me to then go to the various churches leading workshops or speeches about this.
O desprezo que existe da mulher desde que nasceu até a terceira idade é o tema da palestra.
And the theme of my workshop is to talk about how women are considered less from the time of their birth until they're in the old age.
Existe lei que defende a mulher em Moçambique,
In Mozambique, we have laws that defend women,
mas quando acontecem os problemas de assédio sexual,
but when we have situations of sexual harassment,
os sacerdotes da igreja dizem esconde, esconde.
the priesthood of the church says, hide it up, cover it up.
Não tira isso para fora.
Don't ventilate this out beyond our walls.
Esta mulher leva esse problema para a área legal,
But if a woman then takes these problems to the legal world,
os tribunais agem da mesma maneira.
the court systems react almost the same way.
marido desta mulher pode manter relações sexuais com a filha desta mulher que não é filha deste homem.
The husband of this woman can have sexual relations with a daughter of this woman who's but from a different father.
Existiu que marido engravidou a enteada e engravidou a mãe em diferença de 2 vezes, mas disseram
There
para
was a
calar.
situation where the father impregnated the wife and impregnated one of the daughters, all within 2 months of each other.
Disseram para calar-se.
And they said, hush it up.
Esta pessoa vulnerável tem fé, tem alguma coisa que ficou vulnerável mesmo. Não tem onde cair socorrida.
That person was really vulnerable and had no place to seek refuge.
Daí que eu digo que temos sorte porque estamos a aprender, resta saber se nos países vamos agir conforme diz isto.
And so it's important to learn about these and see how we can implement this in our different countries also.
A questão de racismo acontece em todos os lados.
The issues of
Que ela
racism
falou.
happens everywhere, in all places, as she was mentioning.
Mas nós na Metodista Unida temos sorte, estamos a aprender.
But in the Methodist Church, we're lucky that we have these resources that we can learn from.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for naming it. Thank you for naming it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you for your work. I'm putting a plug in there that if you'd like to stay in touch with me, I'll put my email address up there. But my staff, I'm available to come to work with your districts, to work in conferences around issues of violence and the social principles. I believe the social principles are a form of keep us from tearing ourselves apart. The church would be torn apart if it were not for the social principles. So if you're interested in training us on the social principles, please speak with me, and thank you for your attention.